Hello everyone. Jai Bhim and warm welcome to our academic lecture series 2025. It's pleasure to welcome you all today on behalf of Speaking from Margin Collective. This collective has grown from a shared sense of belonging, a space where research, reflection, and resistance come together, where students, scholars, and activists from historically marginalized communities, such as SCs, STs, OBCs, and minorities, can speak from where they are bringing lived experience into academic inquiries. Speaking from margin is a more than just a collective. It's a community committed to making social science a tool for justice and solidarity. Today's lecture takes up a question central to that project, titled Census Against Social Censorship: Why Counting Caste is a Sociological Imperative. Caste shapes so much to Indian life, yet official data often refuses to acknowledge it fully. The absence of caste data is not just a bureaucratic gap, it is a form of social censorship. It keeps inequality invisible and unchallenged. As Professor Jodhka argued in his recent article in the Tribune, quote, political democracy works on the basis of numbers. As democracy percolated down to the hinterland, its social dynamics began to change. The agrarian rich from regionally dominant caste mobilized their communities for electoral politics. By the 1980s, social justice emerged as the new political idiom. While the dominant and backwards gained political power, their representation in government jobs and higher education remained marginal. Unquote. This tension between political inclusion and institutional exclusions reveals why counting caste is not only necessary but urgent. It challenges the silences that project privilege and demands recognition and justice. We are very honored to welcome Professor Surinder S. Jodhka to share his insights today. A leading sociologist at Jawaharlal Nehru University, his work on caste, inequality, rural India, and identities has shaped how many of us understand contemporary Indian society today. His books, including Caste in Contemporary India, The Indian Village, the Oxford Handbook of Caste, and many others, have opened new ways of seeing caste beyond the traditional sociological method. For many here, this is personal. So Jyotka has taught, mentored, and guided many of us in this meeting. His classrooms have been space of encouragement and critical inquiry, especially for scholars navigating the challenges of marginalization. Speaking from margin has created to nurture exactly this kind of space, a space where questions about caste, power, and knowledge can be discussed openly. Over the years, we have had opportunity to learn from the work with an extraordinary group of anti-caste thinkers, activists, and social scientists, including Professor Kancha Ilaya, Professor Rajiv Bhargava, Professor Nivedita Menon, Nandani Sundar, Professor Satish Deshpande, Professor Somber Chaudhary, Dr. Nasreen Chaudhary, Professor Neeraj Chandok, Joya Hassan, Professor N. Sukumar, and many others. Each of these voices has helped build the collective knowledge and solidarity that sustain speaking from margin. Together, we are not just sharing ideas, we are building a movement for inclusive, critical, and just social science. Thank you all for being here today, for joining this conversation, and for helping save this collective. It is my honor to invite you to warmly welcome Professor Surinder Jodhka. Sir, over to you. So we have around 40 to 50 minutes for your lecture, and then we'll open for the Q&A, sir.
Thank you very much, Vidyasagar. Let me begin by stating what Vidyasagar has just said. And all kind of social science activity, even all science activity, they have a kind of normative frame. And the normative frame for discussion on caste in this kind of platform is that at some level we all share this vision of being anti-caste. We think that caste is essentially a structure of violence and caste should have no place in democracy. So I think that is the starting point. And I'm not an activist. Some of you could be, but doing science is also some kind of politics. So what I'm going to do is to kind of try to develop a perspective on it. How should we do a sociology of caste, which is not simply a matter of kind of understanding what is out there, but trying to develop a kind of critical understanding of what is out there. And that obviously then helps us understand complexities of those structures, which in some sense institutionalize and reproduce structures of violence, power, domination, hierarchy. So that is the broader politics within which we are talking about. Suppose all of us, more or less, most of us would agree on that. And given that, given that I'm talking in this context, though I'm not a Hindu, I don't belong to a marginalized caste. Uh, my caste background is not of very high privilege, but it is not either of SC category or OBC category. So I want to say that, but at the same time, I engage with question of caste from a kind of vantage point of what one would call as politics of anti-caste. I think these are important things to state in the beginning so that, our identities are taken into kind of consideration, and then you may disagree with me, but I think let's kind of agree or disagree not on the basis of our identities, but on the basis of our arguments. And I think as human beings, we can develop arguments which are kind of, which we can share and which we can agree upon. Okay, so the starting point, as Vidyasagar was saying, I've been teaching for many years now, and I'll try to deal with it like we talk about it in a kind of friendly kind of setting, in a classroom setting, not as a kind of a conceptual seminar. So let's begin with the context. When we are talking about caste in context of census, one can talk about caste in various contexts. They all overlap, but they could also be significantly different. So if I have to talk about caste in the census, for me, in this kind of topic where we are invoking the idea of some kind of social censorship, we are also talking about, at some level, counting of caste, and we are talking about, in some sense, trying to develop a science of it. How do we sociologically engage with it? So, as I said, first is the question of caste. And second, when we are talking about counting, we are also invoking the idea of modern state. This whole question of counting caste in a framework is very unique to the modern nation state. And that is, in some sense, the context which we need to foreground. We are not talking about caste in a village. We are not talking about caste of a particular community. We are talking about caste in context of the nation state. And then obviously, when we are talking about censorship or sociological imperative, we also are referring to society. Society is a relational process, and as relational process, it is also structure of domination, structure of hierarchy, which I was talking about. So we are referring to something which is more than state, or something which is different from the state. So, and caste obviously is the concept through which we are approaching those structures of hierarchy. Second part of this context is, again, trying to kind of share my concepts. I make a distinction between India as a nation state from what one would call as the Indian society. So in most textbooks of social sciences, anthropology, sociology particularly, we use the notion of Indian society as synonymous with the Indian nation state. And I think this is very important that we separate the two for analytical reasons, but also very importantly for political reasons. The Indian nation state as we know it today, which has its political system, its constitution, and its demographics, which we are talking about, is born in 1947, as we know. Before 1947, part of it was British Empire, part of the British Empire, and part of it was various kinds of states which were governed by the local rulers. And part of it was also, in some sense, which is now different states like Pakistan, Bangladesh. They were also seen as part of India, or the idea of Indian society would include them as well. So one is talking about the present day context, which is not simply a context of an independent country, It is also a context where, in some sense, India becomes part of the larger global system of modern nation states. And within this modern state, nation state, we begin to reimagine Indian society. And this Indian society is different from the generic view of Indian society, which takes us back to ancient times, which takes us back to medieval times, which historians would talk about. Not that they don't overlap, but I think conceptually and analytically, we need to distinguish what I describe as the nation-state society. The world today is made up of nation-state societies from what some people would call as India as a civilizational region. I have problem with the idea of civilization, but broadly one can use that term, that there was this kind of civilizational region, which would include, apart from India, countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even countries like Nepal and perhaps also Sri Lanka. One can extend it to the entire South Asian region as Indian subcontinent, as it is called. So that civilizational history is much bigger, and one should not kind of equate the two, which normally gets done by political activists as well as by the ideologues of the nation state, that India is an ancient culture, ancient society. Yes, Indians have ancient culture and ancient society, but Indian society that we are talking about today, when we are referring to something like enumeration or census, we are talking about India as a nation state society. So why am I putting so much emphasis on nation state society? Because in 1947, this is also the moment when the whole world is restructured politically, right? We have decolonization, and after decolonization, we have this division between first world, second world, and the third world. And there is this context of Cold War, and within that you have countries like India becoming, on the one hand, part of the third world. On the other hand, they also identify themselves as developing countries or developing societies, but they're all societies which are at some level encountering what I call as imperative of change, right? So what becomes most significant for these nation states and the citizens of these nation state, that there is something lacking, there is something which needs to change, and this change becomes a kind of the primary slogan for everyone, from kind of political class to average citizen. Everyone begins to reflect and criticize what exists, what has existed, right? So we think of our society as backward. We think of our society as underdeveloped. We think of our society as conservative. We think of our society as lacking in lots of things which we want to acquire through the process of development. And it is in this context that Indian state, post-colonial Indian state, emerges as a hegemonic institution, as a very powerful hegemonic institution. That nation state is an agency which would help us bring about that change, which would help India become a modern society. And becoming modern becomes a kind of almost like a compulsion, that we don't really have a choice. Anyone who is not part of that project is seen as either backward looking or conservative. So progressive becomes a good word. I'm not against it, by the way, but I think we need to recognize that this is a very specific kind of what one should say imagination, which becomes globally hegemonic in the 20th century, in middle of 20th century. And this, in some sense, is also success of Western kind of colonial powers, where we begin to imagine ourselves in relation to the Western European or Western kind of cultures, and we look up to them as the normatives, as what we want to become. And this, at some level, obviously, imagination of backwardness has three institutions at the center. One is obviously the institution of caste, and the second is village, right? We need to urbanize ourselves. We need to modernize. In order to modernize, we need to get rid of caste. So if you go back to 1940s, before independence, soon after independence, there are three different perspectives that come to frame caste as a part of what I would like to call as the Indian identity. So if we have to think of Indian identity in relation to caste, there is not one single, there is no agreement. So if one was to kind of think of Gandhi, Gandhi's idea of caste is very clear and very simple, that caste is essential part of Indian culture. And here Gandhi obviously equates Indian culture with Hindu religion. And for him, there is nothing wrong in caste, right? He is also a reformist, so he's not saying that we should accept everything about caste. He thinks that, what is wrong with caste is untouchability, but otherwise caste is our history, caste is our past, caste is our tradition, and caste is what makes us what we are. So, and this obviously goes very well with the idea of Indian village as the only, in some sense, normative or utopia through which we can acquire Swaraj. If we want to become independent country, independent culture, then we need to go back to the village. We need to revive the village, or kind of imagine and recover the village. And the village society would be a caste society. In caste society here, he is primarily talking about division of labor kind of thing. So Gandhian perspective at some level survives. Lots of people who may not explicitly identify with it, but I think that hegemonic framework remains, where lots of people would identify with India as a land of Hindus, and Hindu society being a caste society. So there's nothing wrong with caste, even when they would publicly not justify caste, but that's what they want to live with. So on the other extreme, obviously, was Ambedkar. And Ambedkar and Gandhi, as we all know, were always at loggerheads. And for Ambedkar, there was nothing right with Gandhi. Gandhi was completely, in some sense, a conservative person, somebody who did not want to fight against caste. And he found Gandhi very problematic and very, pretentious at some level. And he was obviously talking about annihilation of caste. So on the one hand, there's a project which talks about reforms. On the other hand, there's a project which talks about annihilation, where Ambedkar's view of future is a liberal society where everyone as an individual, which the ideas that are embedded in the Indian Constitution, that we are here as individuals, and as individuals, we are citizens of India as individuals. We have our rights as individuals. We become part of different associations and social life in village and city. So I think that was a very different kind of vision of India. Apart from these two, the main dominant vision, which kind of becomes institutionalized after independence, is obviously the Nehruvian vision. So Nehru was a modernist. Nehru, at some level, agreed on caste question more with Ambedkar than with Gandhi. But Nehru was a liberal modernist. And in liberal modernism, caste should not be there in future. But he was an advocate of what now has come to be known as talking about castelessness, that we stop talking about caste. And if we stop talking about caste, caste would automatically disappear. So what India needs to do is to become a developed country. What India needs to do is to become a modern society. What India needs to do is to have economic growth. And once we have economic growth, once our population moves out of agriculture and from rural areas to urban areas, once we have education becomes very central, and education will teach Indians a new kind of liberal culture, and that at some level would automatically help caste disappear. So what becomes significant here, which is directly connected to why caste was not enumerated in the census, or it was not considered as a variable which should inform state policy, was this idea of development being caste blind, right? The development process should not really consider caste as a variable, even though India introduced a reservation system, but that was on the insistence of Ambedkar and the agreement that Ambedkar had with Gandhi in 1942. So that has a different history. But otherwise, if you look at planning for development or economic models for India's growth, caste is absent there. When India begins to enumerate its poor, poverty was enumerated on the basis of household, not on the basis of identities. So these were individual households, which could be from any caste, which could be any religion, which could be any community, and that's how poverty was tackled. And if we look at the textbooks of sociology, very interestingly, the textbooks of sociology are also largely working with the Nehruvian framework. And I've been studying sociology and I've been teaching sociology. Indian society and sociology of development, they were very closely tied. Say, for example, when you look at the textbooks of sociology, they would also, on the one hand, you have the Dumontian view of caste being a ritual status of traditional society, of Hindu society. On the other hand, there is an imperative of modernization, that the sociology should look at process of change, and social change becomes a very central kind of category. Now, as I've tried to argue in my work, this begins to change slightly. And by 1960s, from this Nehruvian modernity, there is a shift to what one would call as modernity of caste. That caste is an institution which can survive with democracy, and it doesn't need to be annihilated, it doesn't need to be forgotten, it doesn't need to be overcome. What we need to recognize is that caste is a flexible institution. And as a flexible institution, with the process of change, development, most importantly, democratization, when people begin to participate in democratic political process, they begin to mobilize themselves. And this process at some level leads to consolidation of communities around caste lines, but their consolidation is for participation in the electoral process. And there were scholars like Rudolphs and later on Rajni Kothari and many others who wrote on this, that there is a kind of democratization of caste. And this democratization of caste was a very positive thing, because not only caste was entering democratic politics, this process of participation in democratic politics was also democratizing caste, because now you have things like caste associations, and these caste associations have their own elections, their own office bearers. So in the process, what we have is there's a new kind of caste identity which is emerging, which is casteist, but which is not hierarchical. Now, this imagination becomes quite widespread, and different people try to use this in their writings and give a different name. For example, Professor D.L. Sheth, who was a political sociologist in Delhi in Center for Study of Developing Societies, he calls it as a process of ethnicization, that castes are no longer hierarchical systems. Castes have become ethnic formations. So there is a shift from what one would call as vertical hierarchies to horizontal equalities, right? Likewise, you have many others, even somebody like Sudipto Kaviraj also talks about how democratic participation of caste has created equality of castes, that we have differences, but we are not unequal. So what matters is numbers. And if Kashiram can mobilize more numbers, a Dalit can become chief minister. So political life of India's democracy has become already at some level equal. Now, this was also at some level articulated by my colleague in JNU, Dipankar Gupta, who kind of counterposes identity with structure. And he argued that what survives today is caste as an identity, and caste as structure has disappeared. Now, if you look at, and as I have shown in my work, and I've also empirically worked on it, this was a very problematic formulation. And this at some level provides a revised view of what one would call as the perspective of hegemonic elite of India, right? So the Nehruvian elite after 1947 is talking about castelessness in a language which is using the idea of modernity and hoping that India will become a liberal society once we stop talking about caste, to this dominant caste-centric view of caste's politicization, which is again not dealing with the realities of caste, which is working on electoral processes only. And the realities of caste continued to be very significant. And the realities of caste, as I have argued in my writings, different places, were much more substantive. They were not simply about ritual hierarchy. My understanding that these kind of formulations emerge because the textbook understanding of caste is that it's only a kind of a cultural hangover of the Hindus. And this cultural hangover is also now getting over because people are competing with each other, they are participating together. Now, this perspective, which kind of looks at caste merely as a cultural hangover, does not look at what I call as the materialities of caste. The materialities of caste are much more substantive. If you go to a village, you would find Dalits living outside the village. They don't own agricultural land. Their children don't have capacity to go to school. Even if they go to school, their quality of education is very poor. And all this happens because the mainstream society is very actively and proactively biased against Dalit communities, and OBCs have become a little more successful because they also don't own much agricultural land. Their resources are also limited. Even though they don't experience untouchability, their situation is not much different. They are also at some level on the margin, and they struggle in this context. Now, in my understanding, and some of it I tried to write in this small piece in the Tribune, is that this consensus, what I call as the elite consensus on caste, begins to break sometime in the early 1990s. Now, this break or this kind of moment of change comes because of two sets of reasons. One set of reasons are from within the country, and the other set of reasons are from outside the country. Outside the country are easier to kind of identify because in 1990 is the time when Soviet Union collapses. And the collapse of Soviet Union was not simply a localized phenomenon, it was also a restructuring of the modern world. That the way we think of modern world, that undergoes complete change, right? So before that, you have a kind of new liberal shift which comes with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan being leaders of the world economies, and they are kind of dismantling the earlier welfare regimes, and they are kind of now introducing different kinds of systems. But more importantly, from within the country, there are 3-4 major things that happen. So by 1980s, you have a very clear fragmentation of the Nehruvian consensus, which was the dominant hegemonic consensus in India after independence. And this consensus begins to fragment because of the logic of class and caste after independence. So all these dominant castes which come into the mainstream of Indian nation state after 1960s, with the dominant caste becoming politicized, they bring in a very different kind of political language. And this political language is also trying to find space in the mainstream. But at the same time, you also have the emergence of a new kind of Dalit middle class. This middle class, in some sense, grows from within the Sarkari office. They are quota middle class, as people call it. These are people who come into government jobs through reservations, and once they are there, they are at some level also beginning to organize themselves because they experience caste very differently. And the example of Kashiram, I've written a paper on Kashiram which came out in EPW, and that in some sense begins to articulate itself in a new kind of social movement in the 90s, initially around the employees, BAMSEF as Kashiram starts, and later on it becomes Bahujan Samaj Party. And this is also the time when the old kind of village social structure begins to disintegrate. And this happens because of Green Revolution, because of democratization, because of other programs for development. So all this at some level leads to a kind of a weakening of that hegemonic hold of the Nehruvian elite. And this weakening of the hegemonic hold is accompanied by another important kind of fact, and that was the centenary celebration of Ambedkar's birth. That also happens around the same time. So in the 1990, you have the introduction of Mandal Commission report, and this Mandal Commission report, in some sense, brings about many changes in the political system. But more importantly, you also have the collapse of Soviet Union, which leads to change in the economic policies of Government of India, and you have economic liberalization. So now all these very contradictory forces are coming together in the early 90s, and that's a very, very important kind of defining moment in which we are still living. So there is a kind of opening up of the system where different actors begin to matter. And the 90s, post 90s, India begins to develop in a very different manner. On the one hand, you have the emergence of what one would call as Dalit Bahujan politics. Christoph Jefferlow called it as silent revolution. It was not so silent, which is the rise of OBCs in particularly in North India. In South India, OBC politics was already very, very significant in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, even in other states of South India. But in North India, it is in the late 80s, early 90s, with the rise of Samajwadi politics, that it becomes much more kind of significant and visible. And likewise, you have, as I was talking about, Kashiram mobilizing Dalit identity, and it becomes possible for him. He works very hard. He goes around on his bicycle tours, and he's able to wean away the local Dalits from Congress party, and he's able to bring them into BSP, and that was a significant change. But what people don't talk about, and this is where I think my main argument lies, and I'll stop after 10 minutes or so, and that was that the kind of economic growth India witnessed in the 90s transformed India's urban middle class, or India's middle class generally. And some people have written on it. We have also written on it. Others have also said that how post-90s Indian middle class grows in size, but more importantly, it grows in influence. The post-90s urban middle class, which is largely urban upper caste, their numbers go up not very significantly. Some people would say that it is going up to 30%, 40%. But actually now, when economists actually calculate, so there is not really very large numbers. And some people also talk about its shrinkage. But what happens is that in the 90s and the early 2000s, middle class becomes the normative. So middle class becomes a kind of moral majority. It becomes a kind of hegemonic space where everyone wants to be. Everyone wants to be part of the urban middle class. And this is obviously, the implication of this is what I describe as the decline of agrarianism. Until 1980s, those who were landowning communities, who were involved in agriculture, who were rural rich, they were very proud of themselves. And their children were also very proud of the fact that they came from landed families. So the post-1990s, with the growing hegemony of the urban middle class, and this is also accompanied with decline of the Indian state. So bureaucratic positions begin to lose value. And the value is of the market. And this market is controlled by the corporate capital, but the immediate person who is kind of been their neighbor, who goes there and begins to earn a large salary and is globally mobile, is this new corporate middle class which is employed in the private sector. And that's where new jobs begin to come in. The government jobs begin to shrink. So now this obviously creates a very interesting kind of moment where, on the one hand, India has become a much more democratic country, right? It's much more, at some level, open to everyone. Even young Dalits are also aspiring to be part of the urban middle class. Education has spread. I mean, the school children go to schools. If you look at the data post 1990s, nearly every child goes to school. We don't even talk about these days illiteracy or stuff like that. So education level have grown. But if you look at the cultural life of India's elite, that becomes much more sectarian. That becomes much more exclusionary. So this new urban elite is very unapologetic about his or her prosperity or his or her distinction, right? They're very proud of it and they think that this is something that we have achieved on our own. So there's a new discourse of, taxpayers and uh, uh, and the taxpayers begin to see everyone else as drag, right? So reservation, for example, becomes a contentious issue and people begin to mobilize against reservations. What we know, Aam Aadmi Party, if you look at the history of Aam Aadmi Party, people like Kejriwal, they were mobilizing, they were youth for equality kind of movement which comes up there. So there's a much more aggressive kind of stance that this middle class begins to take. And in the post 1990s, you've seen anti-Mandal movement. They were kind of very aggressive to begin with, but they continue to unfold themselves in one way or the other. Anti-corruption movement also was at some level a kind of reflection of that middle class assertion, which was very, very urban and which was very kind of, exclusionary. And this middle class is also far more diverse than the earlier Nehruvian middle class was. Nehruvian middle class was a very small section of the not only urban upper caste, but the historical traditional elite among the urban upper castes who were landlords and who came from, if you look at the biographies of people who were part of freedom movement, on those who became India's elite, except with the exception of people like Ambedkar and maybe half a dozen others, they all had studied in Oxford or Cambridge and London and they'd come back. So to begin with, they were from very rich families who could afford that kind of education, right? So they, at some level, were a very small, narrow section of Indian society. And it is at this time that you have a new kind of cultural idiom, which is on the one hand very exclusionary, but at another level, it is also anti-Dalit. And it begins to take shape and it begins to also articulate itself through a different kind of politics. And that politics at some level is what is in some sense become hegemonic in the past 10, 12 years. So this is the time when Congress is declining, Congress fragmentation is happening. It has already happened. Dalit has moved out of Congress, OBC has moved out of Congress, and Muslim minority is disillusioned with Congress because they take opportunistic positions. And this is how when BJP's consolidation happens, its social base is not just the old traditional elite. Its social base is this new middle class, but also along with this new middle class, the new class of aspiring elite coming from other sections. And it is this aspiring elite which the Hindu right wing is very successfully able to accommodate within their own kind of political process. And as I've argued in one of my paper on Kashiram, that how they used politics of hissedari, which was initially imagined by Kashiram to accommodate subsections of different kind of constitutional categories, whether it is within Dalits, SCs, or within OBCs, and they gave them representation. And through representation, they are accommodated in the larger politics of Hindutva. And this, at some level, if you look at the data on elections, and we know already a lot about caste, it's not like we don't know caste numbers. Post 90s or post 2000s, the Hindutva politics is successful, or BJP politics is successful because they have been able to bring into their fold a large section of the other backward classes, right? And they do it through representational politics, but there is also a symbolic politics of reimagined Hindutva. Earlier, Hindutva was a very kind of upper caste, urban Hindutva. And this new Hindutva, which is kind of unfolding itself, during the second decade of the 21st century is much more inclusive in political language. And it is here, I think, the kind of, the manner in which Congress and Rahul Gandhi are able to decode that politics. And caste census becomes a very important point through which OBCs can be mobilized, right? Even though Mandal Commission, it was implemented, after Mandal Commission, people had talked about, in demographic and statistical terms that, we are 50% or 55% or 80% or 70%, but there are no numbers, right? Every time there's a case that goes to the judiciary, judiciary asks for data, and the data is not available. And OBC elite is very aware of this lack, even though there is a representational politics. But unless you have data, their participation in the system remains symbolic, right? So even though they are accommodated as chief ministers or even prime ministers or presidents, so this remains politically symbolic. And this political symbolism needs to be contested at the state level. And that's why I started with right in the beginning that we need to keep that idea of nation state at the center stage. So how does nation state work? Nation state is a very, very powerful institution, even though markets have become very influential. But if you look at Indian capitalism, it cannot function without the support of Indian nation state. Indian nation state, right from the time of independence, has been playing very, very important critical role in India's economic growth and the process of economic growth. So state is still very critical for marginalized sections. And the resources that state can provide are the only resources that they can hope for meaningfully, right? So it is in this context that when this talk about caste census, and this talk has been going on for last 25 years, it was around 2000, 2001 census that this question of caste enumeration was first raised by some groups that we need to, after Mandal Commission, because of, as I said, some courts raised this. So, but sociologists also talked about it. And by 2011, it has become already a very big demand. And as we know, it was also supposed to be part of the caste for the national census. But then they thought that, we will do a separate socio-economic census. The data never came out. So this was something which was, in some sense, becoming a popular demand. And since it has become a popular demand, and at some level, when you are politically empowered, and you can see that there is this kind of problem that exists. And it is the time when you have this whole discussion about subclassification. Now, subclassification discourse might hurt some communities within the SCs, but it has a widespread support among the non-dominant SC communities in each region. And with the Supreme Court judgment, it has become even more critical. And again, it cannot be done without data, right? So there is a new kind of popular imagination which begins to articulate around numbers, that how many of us are there. And this also goes back to what I was earlier talking about, question of hissedari. So I think this is the reason why, in context of Bihar elections and various other reasons, that Government of India has accepted the demand, or they have promised that they would do caste census. How will it get done? When will they do it? We still don't know. But assuming that they are sincere about it, what will it do? And this is my final point, and I'll stop after 2-3 minutes. And see, now there are 2-3 opinions which are already floating around. One is that it is a bad idea, right? When you bring in caste, one, it is very hard to enumerate. And we know that Britishers had tried to enumerate it, and they created a lot of mess. And that's why they stopped enumerating after 1931. Second argument is that if you enumerate, then it would lead to mobilizations around caste, which would make India more casteist. So best is not to enumerate caste, and it's a bad idea. Second position, I think, is to kind of think of it as a kind of very innocuous kind of exercise. It won't really make any difference. We already know about numbers. How does it matter if we have some more data on caste? So it is not something that is going to automatically bring about any change. So we'll have some numbers, but again, there would be some problems. So it's not a bad thing to do, but by itself, it's not going to really be of much significance. So there is an element of truth in this. And today, I think our friend Harish Wankhede has published that, this is not really going to make much of a difference unless there is a very kind of strong political will to transform India. Now, I understand this argument, and I also, in some sense, recognize its value. So nothing is going to happen unless there is political will. Now, where does political will come from? And I think that's where I think we need to kind of conclude that political will comes from political mobilizations. It doesn't come necessarily from one leader from above, right? Sometimes it can, that there is one leader who decided to implement something and it got implemented. But in most cases, the source of political will has always been social movements, right? So once you open up this kind of big book of census and different communities begin to look at their numbers, and since numbers matter in democratic politics, there would be different kinds of discussions, narratives, different kinds of aggregations. So at one level, it would produce a huge amount of fragmentation within these categories called OBCs and SCs, right? These are constitutional aggregations. The moment you have data, the data will be around jatis. Like we already have data on SCs. We also have data on SC jatis. So when we are talking about OBCs, OBC is a very large kind of spectrum, right? There are now sub-classifications within OBCs. So if you were to kind of look at all the OBCs, what will happen is that people will begin to look at the number of people are there in their jatis, where all they are concentrated, right? If they are spread out in 3 districts of UP, they will connect with each other. And then there would be a new kind of demand which would be articulated, so something that which happened in the early 20th century. So there'll be a new kind of mobilization that will begin to happen. Now that's where caste census or data on caste has the potential of producing a new kind of churning. And that is something which is hard to predict at the moment, right? It could create mess, but I think I'm in favor of caste census as a sociologist, as a social scientist, as Indian citizen. We should not be scared of mess, because unless you open up this can of worms or whatever you like to call it, so we cannot deal with caste. Caste needs to be annihilated, right? And for annihilation of caste, we need proactive state policies, proactive political intervention, right? And that proactive political intervention can happen only when we begin to talk about those structures of hierarchy which tend to be not so invisible, but unless you have a legitimate language through which you can talk about them, they don't become part of the policy narrative. So caste has become part of policy narrative, but it still remains very peripheral. It remains very kind of, at some level it comes in, at some level it doesn't come in. So when we talk about, say, corporate sector, private sector, that's where Indian economy is growing, we have some studies, but we don't have much data. Which communities are coming into business and who are being marginalized, how is state support being distributed, and the way markets are functioning. So it's not only in relation to the state, it's not only in relation to jobs, it would also be in relation to larger economic processes. So I think politically, India has already become quite plural and democratic, but beyond political sphere, India still remains a very kind of divided and hierarchical world when it comes to economy, and even more importantly, when it comes to culture. And culture and economy are related to each other. When we talk about, cultural capital and kind of resources that people require to get into highly valued jobs, that's where these elite dynamics come back. in action. And again, this is something on which there is work available. I've also worked on. Sorry for taking a little longer. I'll stop here, but we can talk about whatever you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very, I would say, deeply, analytical and enriching discussion, especially the tracing the relationship, which is very complex between caste and state, and I believe, based on my limited understanding of caste enumeration, that enumeration has never been, neutral project, but deeply, political act, which lies with the, tied with the question of visibility, power, and justice. And especially, I think I remember your article, which draw this idea of Gandhian moral reform and Nehruvian developmental and Ambedkar's structural critique of state or society, which I think very much helpful for us to understand this question of caste, and especially the analysis of how caste functions beyond the traditional hierarchies. So I have nothing much to say on that, because it's a really a lot of thoughts for us to think and analyze. But will open the floor for question and answer, and we request from our participants to please be precise and focused, and that will allow us to take, many questions as much we can. So you can also write in chat box, we can read for
A question from Priya Sangmitra. She can ask question right away.
Hello,
Good if you
Professor.
open
Yeah,
your video also.
am I audible, Professor?
Yeah, tell me
Professor
please.
Jodhka. I first of all found your talk very enriching, and I have been following the cast as a census conversation quite closely. And one of your colleagues, Mr. Harish Wankhede, has written an article in the Hindu today on caste census, which is not a silver bullet for social justice. So, because caste census is being propagated by the ruling party as something that would be a means for social justice, and in its defense, he has said that all of these important landmark initiatives such as reservation or your land reforms, Mandal Commission kind of had have been driven not by statistical numbers but per se, but by political struggles and important mass mobilizations and a moral commitment of the ruling class, which I find is a very insightful way to put people and the ruling party into the picture other than what the nation state represents. So what are your thoughts on that?
I thought that's what I concluded with. That's what I was saying towards the end. That
Right.
I kind of agree with his point, but the point is that the
Yeah,
pressure,
this
the
is
political
yeah.
will has to come from social movements also.
Yeah.
And census could create, I mean, it would depend on various other factors. So the census, if we have data, if we have numbers, it would create fragmentations, but it could also create new solidarities. So that would depend on time. You can't really speculate, but I'm saying it's more than just numbers. When you're talking about census is a much bigger kind of process and weapon than just numbers. So one needs to take that also into account.
Right. Thank you.
you can raise your hand, or either you can write in the chat box. We can take from there.
One last question, Professor Priya again. uh, just wanted to get another confirmation as to, like, we were already having caste being recorded right in the decennial census. So why is there a pushing need to sub categorize this further? Like, were we not doing this before?
Sorry, can you write your question? I can't hear you. I mean, your voice is breaking. Vidyasagar, did you hear it?
Yeah,
Priya,
I'll type.
sure, thank you.
Yeah.
There are not many questions. I think maybe we can wind up if there are no questions, or if you have any question.
There's a question in chat box, sir. Wanted to know your thoughts on the census and
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is about the marginalized only. The entire thing is about the marginalized. So caste census today, when we are doing census, it is primarily on the around the question of marginalized groups to recognize that India's marginality is structured around caste. So we'll get to know that. I think that's a very important way to kind of figure out that is it because of caste that India, and that again, see, once you have data, economists and other demographers will start working on the data. And when you start working on the data, then lots of things will come out, right? So we will have a much better understanding of caste and its relationship with economic processes, its relationship with marginalities. Now we work with some kind of notion. Some people would say, yeah, there are poor Brahmins. What is the difference between a Dalit caste and Brahmins? On the other hand, some people would say, yeah, everything is around caste lines. So unless we have data, unless we have that kind of economics, some economics is being done, but it's again being done again through aggregates. You have data on SCs and general category. Then again, general category would also get disaggregated, right? What do we mean a general category? Does general mean not having caste? That's what it suggests, right? These are people who don't really have any caste attribute to their economic life, which is not true, right? So once they also have a caste attribute, then it will begin to be articulated very differently.
Sure, sir, should I read?
Yeah. So good. Yeah, I mean, these are good questions. Yes, we enumerate only scheduled castes. This question, which is, I think, Malvika to everyone, in the context of precarious political times that we are in, don't you think that the government might have agreed to the census having a hidden agenda? Well, possible, you never know. Yeah, I mean, this is not so hidden agenda. Immediate context is Bihar elections, and obviously they would have their agenda, but these are things once state does it, it becomes open to everyone. There's a caste that is denotified tribe. Yes, area reservation status. Yes, see, a very good example. I mean, this is what we need census for. So many of these titles are, so we think of caste system as an ancient reality which came into existence sometime, 4,000, 5,000 years back or 2,000 years back after Manu wrote his text, which is empirically not the case. There is a kind of truth in that there is a Brahminical system which takes birth with Vedic philosophy, and Manusmriti was actually written, and it was also a very popular text. It continues to be very popular text. But at the same time, identities, local communities are formed locally, right? When we are talking about denotified, for example, this denotification is very directly connected with the colonial power, because colonial rulers identified certain communities as criminal tribes, and they use the word tribe, not caste, for them. And then after independence, all those communities were denotified. They were no longer notified as tribes. But then denotification itself becomes a stigma, because then they are clubbed together as denotified communities, right? So denotified tribes means DNTs, and DNTs are then again trying to ask for certain kinds of special status. And there is also active prejudice against them in the state administration, in state bureaucracy, in the local level police. So I think these are very important processes, and we need to engage with them at the local level with the local state. And this is where census would perhaps be of some use, that, yeah, there are other communities also, they are they are known like this, and they are there in our neighboring district, which is in the neighboring state, and how they come together. So these are kind of interesting processes which would produce lots of difficult questions, but also political mobilizations. I just wanted to know that you mentioned about enumeration and how it will be impactful. Wouldn't it create further divided society and increase? Yes, it will divide the society, but society is already divided. Will it increase discrimination? I don't think so. I think the subtle discrimination, if it becomes classified as discrimination, then you have the possibility of engaging with it, of dealing with it. Like we have the category of scheduled caste in India. In Pakistani Punjab, after 1947, they stopped enumerating SCs. There are no census data on SCs because that category doesn't exist because Pakistan is an Islamic state. So if you look at those communities, they are still there. Their condition perhaps would be much worse than the condition of SCs in India, because SCs at least have reservations. There is some case they can politically get mobilized, respond to their aspirations. So I think we need to deal with the realities as they are rather than try to hide them. People used to say similar thing about men and women differences. No, why do you talk about gender separately? But talking about separately does not mean dividing. On a culture of dignity and culture which kind of gives dignity to everyone, and in some sense eliminates cultures of humiliation and violence from society. And for that, you need to identify them. You can't really get rid of something unless you identify where the stink is coming from.
Yeah. So I have one question, which is probably
Yeah.
then probably we'll wind up the discussion. So if I mean that's like a, again assumption. So do you think like this caste census, if they are like if concluded, it's also going to save the sociological theories we have right now to understand the caste as a concept, if it's really came with a wide range of perspective and layers of details.
Yes, I think it will help us. See, my own argument is that if we want to talk about caste from a policy perspective, we need to engage with caste empirically. We can't have this notional idea of caste as a Varna system, which works at an all India level, which is hierarchical structure on these 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 categories. I think that's meaningless, because if the state has to engage with caste, we also need to theorize caste differently. And their theorization, caste census data on caste will help us theorize that kind of empirical realities. So what has happened is that as many people talk about how Indian society, the view of Indian society is largely taken from the textual sources. And this was something which was started by Srinivas in 1950s, from we need to move from book view to field view. And I think census will create a lot of data from ground, and then will help us reimagine not only caste, but also perhaps larger Indian society.
I think we don't.
Okay, then. Thank you very
Yeah.
much for listening to. Yeah,
Uh,
please go.
I had a question. So, thank you so much for the talk, sir. I actually had a question regarding the 4 points that you made and that I could gather and summarize from the talk that you gave just now. The very first point is that of the elite consensus that you spoke about. The second being the ethnicization of caste. And the third one being BJP's representational and symbolic politics of caste. And the fourth one, popular imagination around numbers that comes from caste census. So I want to put these 4 points together, and I want to pose now a question to you. I want to go beyond the general theme that has been coming of political will, and instead question the very politics of caste identity itself. And the question then is that do we now need a new imagination of articulating what you call the materiality of caste, because somewhere or the other, the way caste politics has been functioning has also been a lot around representation and numbers. And BJP also has a very representational way of functioning. And so is the cultural way of operating. If castes are seen as differences, and if caste groups are now asserting themselves as separate cultural groups, as Balamurali Natarajan's culturalization of caste argument would go. So how do we then imagine a new politics of articulating, again, what you call the materiality of caste?
Yeah, sorry, Sanjana, I've not heard you very clearly. Your voice was breaking. I hope my voice is also not breaking like that. There's some
No, sir,
problem with the
your voice
connection.
is fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably on my end.
Yeah, I recently published a paper in EPW. It's called On the Futures of Caste. So I don't know if you have
All
seen
right,
it or
sir.
not.
No, I
On the
haven't. I'll
Futures of
definitely look it up.
Caste.
All right.
I'll share it on researchgate.net today itself.
Okay.
It was published in Economic and Political Weekly last year, where I've dealt
All
with
right.
precisely these questions, what you are raising, right? I've
All
not
right.
used the word elite consensus there, but this whole idea about how we need to move towards engaging with what I call, and you also mentioned, materialities of caste. And I've developed it at great length. I also discussed it in my this award lecture, which I delivered in Chennai last year, Malcolm Adishashi Award. That's also available on YouTube if you want to see my presentation. But this paper that came out in EPW last year is called On the Futures of Caste. I've dealt with all these things there in greater detail, but I'm working on it in a different way now, what I presented today for another lecture also.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. I'll definitely look up.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. And really thankful for all the participants who joined today. And we hope today's discussion stays with you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.